Almost a year ago, I made a video about my problems with Constitution in D&D 5e. I don't really recommend going back to it now, as if you watch it, it's very clear that I am very much just getting the hang of the whole recording and editing thing. One day I'd like to go back and make that video again, however, today I want to do something different. I want to talk about Constitution's mental cousin, Charisma. It's my belief that Charisma as a stat was made for a bygone age of RPGs. The type of games that most people run today just don't work well with the Charisma stat, and in some ways, Charisma actually hinders their games. Charisma, as defined in the player's handbook, is confidence, eloquence, and leadership. It's your character's ability to persuade, lie, or intimidate. The more charisma you have, the more likely it is that you'll succeed at one of these things. For a lot of games, charisma can be a very useful shorthand for your character's, well, charisma. Everything else about a character, from their strength to their speed to their intelligence, is also determined by their stats, so it makes sense that charisma would be among one of those things. However, the issue I have is that I don't think charisma necessarily works for every game, and the way I'm seeing a lot of people play D&D nowadays, I'm seeing charisma kinda hinder their play experience. What I'm seeing is charisma being the most overpowered stat in the game. Most players who play with a high charisma stat, especially if that stat is tied to their damage with a paladin or a bard, well, you're going to see them doing much better than other characters just because of that charisma stat. And let me explain why. D&D, the way it's meant to be played, is meant to be broken down into 3 different stages: social, exploration, and combat. The idea is you might start with social, the players talking around, trying to get information, learning about potential new quests, or gaining more information about the quests they're about to go on. Then you're going to have the exploration section, which is going to be them going into a dungeon, exploring around. Then you're going to have the combat session, everything from when they roll initiative to when initiative is over. But there's no specific rule or guideline to how much of these you need to have. It's just the idea that you're going to have these 3 separate stages, which each benefit 3 different types of play, and benefit stats differently. With the social stage, obviously charisma is going to benefit the most, with potentially some intelligence and wisdom being involved a little bit with remembering different things about the lore. However, more than likely, it's mostly going to be charisma checks. With exploration, you're going to see mostly wisdom and intelligence rolls. You will see some strength for moving a boulder out of a way, or dexterity for jumping across a large gap. However, predominantly when you're exploring around, your perception, so you can see the things that are in front of you, and insight to understand things about them, or arcana in nature, understand what they actually mean. These are going to be the most important stats in these areas. And then in combat, well, every character is supposed to be somewhat good at combat, or at least have their role within combat. So even though strength, dex, and con are the most useful stats generally within combat, you're also going to see some exceptions. For example, the wizard, because of their spells, their intelligence is important in combat. For the cleric, wisdom. For the paladin, charisma. Which meant if you're playing a charismatic character like a paladin, well, you're going to be really useful in the social areas, you're going to be really useful in combat. However, during exploration, that's another opportunity where you get to step back and watch all the other characters shine. Your strength will still allow you to get involved, however, you aren't going to be the most important character here. Other classes are better at exploration, and so they're going to get to take the lead, just how you're more likely to take the lead in social situations. And that's where the problem is. I don't know about you, but unless I'm playing in an adventure book, I don't see a lot of D&D played like this anymore. Exploration has kind of faded away, and the main focus tends to be social aspects and combat. In fact, in some games I've played, even combat has been taken away to the wayside for just a general roleplay focused game, which means that charisma is the dominant skill. While you don't need a perfect balance of social exploration and combat, it should be somewhat balanced. If you have a game that is 70% social and 30% combat, well, that's going to cause some issues. Mainly, if you're playing a character who has a really low charisma, there's a whole part of the game where you feel like you need to step back from and not be a major part of. Some players might be fine with this. However, there's a lot of players who are going to feel restricted into playing high charisma characters if they feel like they're going to need to use that stat more than any other one. Players in modern D&D are persuading, lying, and intimidating more than they ever were before. This means that you're gonna really struggle to help with the party if charisma's your dump stat. Let's think of it this way. If you know you have to go talk to the king, and you know this is going to be a very difficult, stressful charisma challenge, are you going to send your knight who actually does know how to speak with nobility very well, however the player gave them a -1 charisma? Or are you going to pick the bard, someone who is actual street trash, however they have a +8 in all their charisma checks? In the long run, this is going to mean that even if you aren't saying it explicitly, players playing low charisma characters are going to feel like they're supposed to keep themselves out of NPC interactions. They're going to want to leave it up to the party's face. And if you're running a game where 75% of the time, or even more, is going to be social interactions, well, you shouldn't have a party face. Like, imagine we were playing in a totally different RPG system, and you realized that the most optimal thing you could do in combat was to skip your turn and give it to a different player. Well, why would you bother still showing up to these games when every time combat starts, you know that the best thing you should do is to just stay out of it? The other problem with charisma is very much in how people often run charisma, in which it creates a disconnect between player action and outcome. The purpose of stats is to fill in the blanks between what I want my character to do and what they're actually capable of doing. I can't jump 15 feet, and I can't shoot a bow accurately. However, according to my character sheet, they can. However, I could make a good argument to a shopkeeper on why they should sell a sword to me at a lower cost. Or I can think of a clever enough alibi so the guard would have no way of knowing that I was there when a crime was committed. I can't cast magic, but I can lie and I can intimidate. However, the way D&D works now, it doesn't actually matter how strong of an argument I use against a shopkeeper or a guard. All that matters is what I roll. Which to some players might seem perfectly fine. It's a game about random chance. That's the point. However, the issue I'm trying to point out is what would be the point of role-playing if role-playing has no effect on the game? If I'm going to go through the effort of trying to think of a convincing lie and it has no effect on the gameplay, why should I bother with doing all that when I could just say, oh, I'm going to lie to the guard to get away with it? If putting energy and effort into something has the same outcome as not putting in that energy, well, most people are going to pick the one with less energy, same outcome. Which all of that is what I would say if that were the case. However, often it is not. In most games, if you give a convincing speech to your DM, they'll often give you advantage on the roll, or they'll secretly lower the DC. I know this because I've done it before. Sometimes I realize I've done it without even intentionally doing it. I just hear a convincing argument, and in my head I go, oh yeah, that would be pretty easy for the guard to believe, and I make it a low DC. I'm pretty certain that if the player had given me a bad argument, that I would have made the DC higher. But that doesn't really make sense, does it? I mean, why should charisma be the only stat in the entire game where it's easier to succeed on checks if you're, in real life, better at that skill? If I'm asking a player for a strength check, I'm not going to ask them how much they can deadlift. So to break it down, my main issue with charisma is that it doesn't really work well with roleplay focused games. Charisma just becomes the best stat in the game, and if you want to roleplay a low charisma character, you're gonna not get a lot out of it. On top of that, the way we might determine difficulty checks might be antithetical to encouraging our players to roleplay more. And if we make the roles actually determined by how convincing a player is, well, all that does is really punish the players who in real life just aren't that charismatic. So what would I do if I had the opportunity to change it? Well, in theory, I could go on this long tirade about removing charisma entirely and breaking down D&D into just 4 core stats. However, that would be really convoluted, take a really long time, and not really be useful advice. At that point, I'm basically making a brand new system, and it would just make sense to make a new system or play in a different system rather than to be playing D&D. You play D&D because it is how it is, and the way it is that it has 6 main stats. 3 physical, 3 mental. So we can't get rid of charisma. However, I think there's some minor tweaks we can do to try to alleviate the issues that we have here. Firstly, I think we need to try to think about charisma differently. The way that we often think about charisma is a little weird in the way that if we roll low on charisma, we don't describe it as the player not being charismatic, but rather the NPC not being convinced. If a player fails their athletic check to lift a boulder, you'd probably describe it as them not being able to get a good grip or just not being strong enough to lift the boulder. However, if it's an intimidation check, you're going to often describe it as the NPC being too tough and hardened to be fazed by this intimidation. Your role isn't about the fearlessness of the NPC, that's what the DC is for. Your role is to determine how successfully you can do the thing you're trying to do. So just like with an athletics check, the player is going to describe what they want to do, and then they're going to roll, and then the DM will describe what happens. In the same way, if the player is trying to intimidate, they tell you what they want to say, and then they roll to see how successfully they do that. If they roll low, well, maybe their voice cracks or they stutter over a big word, which, if that's how charisma is determined, I have a charisma of 3. Maybe their own personal fear means that as they yell and they point their finger's actually shaking, and that helps the NPC call their bluff. That helps with that disconnection between what the player says and what happens in the game. Yeah, sure, you tried to say something really intimidating, but you couldn't do it, rather than saying, oh yeah, you said that thing that's really intimidating, however, the NPC just wasn't intimidated by it. Secondly, I want to deal with party faces. I think it's fine for someone to want to be the main social character of their group, the leader, if you would. But if roleplay is a major part of the game, there shouldn't be someone who feels like the main character, who's doing all the talking and making all the choices. Everyone should have an equal opportunity to stand out. The first thing you can do there is, of course, have an NPC specifically talk to a particular party member. You'd want to do this, obviously, with the party members who get to talk the least. An example of this could be you have a dwarf character who doesn't get to talk much because their charisma is an 8. However, they go into a shop and there's a dwarf shopkeeper, and that shopkeeper wants to catch up with a fellow dwarf. And so that gives them an opportunity to roleplay where anyone else is unlikely to get involved, because it's very clear that as the conversation goes on and they get more happy with each other, that the shopkeeper might even give them better deals because of that connection. Another option could be, for example, if the party are standing in front of a king having a conversation with him, the king might realize that, hey, one of these people is speaking for all the rest, and then insist the conversation can only continue if he hears from one of the other party members. The other thing you can try to do is to split the party. Maybe 2 conversations need to happen at the same time, so 2 people need to decide who they're going to speak to, and therefore you can't have one party face that's doing all the conversing. Of course, you don't need to try to have 2 conversations simultaneously. You can do them in sequence, one conversation with one person, then another conversation with another, but in the lore of the story, they're happening at the same time in 2 different places. There are 2 things I would look out for with this. The first thing is that you have to be careful with whether or not the party actually want this. Sometimes there's some party members who just like hearing other people talk and don't really feel comfortable having whole social conversations in character. Some people are just fine with that. and that's totally okay. You also want to make sure that you're not totally preventing the party face from being involved in conversations, because if you take away their opportunity to talk too much, well, now they're going to feel excluded, especially as someone who wanted to be the one talking the most. Like every situation, it's up to knowing your party and knowing what's right for them and what's right for you. The other thing you can do is to allow other stats to roll on deception, intimidation, and persuasion rolls. This is already something that's allowed in D&D's rules. However, I very rarely see it ever come up. If you want to roll an intimidation check, however, you're intimidating by throwing a big heavy chair across a room, well, that might be a strength check and not a charisma, so instead of rolling -1, you could be rolling +4. Or with persuasion, maybe this person is trying to get a good look at the person in front of them and really understand their facial features to see if they're liking what they're saying or not. Well, that could be a wisdom roll. Or maybe someone's coming up with an elaborate lie. Well, they could use their intelligence to help keep their story consistent. This allows players who might not have given themselves a high charisma stat to still be involved in social interactions and be involved in charisma checks. And hopefully that helps. D&D is not a balanced game, nor is it a perfect game. And there are so many people playing it today in so many different ways that one mechanic might be perfect for one group and how they want to play, but might absolutely hinder another group. As always, this is just my opinion, and hopefully you could take away a different perspective from this that you didn't have before. If you want to support my channel, the best thing you can do is hitting that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, and this is the end of the video. Almost a year ago, I made a video talking about my problems with Constitution in 5e. I don't recommend going... Oh my god, fucking Christ! It's down here. Idiot.